Good morning, lads, lasses, and you non-binary folk. How are we all feeling today? Delicious. Goodness. Bit of a rush this morning to get this stream set up. For the first time in a very long time, I slept in. Bloody shock that is. That cracked. But yes, morning card box. Nose is a bit itchy. But yes. Goodness gracious me, that was a bit of a rush. Hope I got everything set up properly, eh? I sound right, I'm not muted. Oh. Evening, Douglas. Sorry, somebody tried to call me. Suddenly I'm popular. With my family, that is. Douglas, I feel like I've seen you before. Good evening to you in Canada. I'm aware that most of the people who listen to me are in America or Canada. And it is evening for you fellas. I'm just going to message somebody for a moment. I'll go still and rigid for a moment. Okay. Goodness. My brother was trying to call me. No idea why. He seemed very insistent though, let's hope it wasn't bad news. But yes, evening. All, it is time for some reading. Now I have a couple of things prepared, but not all that much prepared this stream, not as much as I usually do. I was hoping maybe for some suggestions of things you'd like to hear read. If you so can, I'll keep reminding everyone throughout it if you have any suggestions you wanna. But it's good to see you, Cardbox and Douglas. In another time it would have been morning for me, but now I've become a member of productive society and whatnot. Ooh, look at you. Fancy. And I'm on my way out of being a productive member of society if I keep sleeping in like this. Goodness. Waking up at 9 o'clock. Disgraceful. But what's everyone's poison for this evening or this morning? Mine is a wonderful cup of black tea from... well, it's an English breakfast. I'm not too sure where it's from. Finally got milk delivered to me. To each their own. Yes, I finally got my milk delivered to me. You see, I'm in quarantine right now, so... life water. That life-giving water. The greatest addiction of all. But yes, I'm in quarantine right now. And so I can't go out and get my own bloody shopping. And you have to have a $50 order if you want to get home delivery from a lot of the supermarkets. It's daylight robbery, frankly. Ah well. At least I have milk for my tea. Can't complain about that. But yes. Yeah, that picture. Got to add that picture to this, didn't I? But yes, I think we'll start. Should I start with the longest joke or the loaded dog? We're in lockdown, but it seems to have calmed down. Yes, I was at a wedding. In another state in Australia. And unfortunately, between states there's quite heavy restrictions of travel. Luckily, I was able to do a home quarantine because I was close enough to the airport in my regional centre. However, that still means I need to stay home for quite a while. Because I went to a wedding and then flew back. It's not quite a lockdown, it's more a lockdown for people, a quarantine for people who aren't part of the state. We didn't really have that many lockdowns in Queensland, where I live. I'm trying to find. So I have to look at an actual book to find the loaded dog. There it is, loaded dog. 298. Wait, that'd be right. But yes, I do apologize, I was distracted looking for the right story. There we are. You have self-isolation when you come back from a hot zone. Yes, it's essentially the same thing, except they declared all of New South Wales, where the wedding was, a hotspot. So, I had to do self-isolation. And you can't actually drive back, so... What happened is our whole family that live in Queensland that wanted to go to the wedding all got into one giant van. Lockdown's when somebody has contact tracing, yes. Got into one giant van and drove down with a lot of stuff. And then the people who wanted to stay down there for a while stayed down there for a while with the van, and the rest of us flew back. Problems of a large family, I suppose. So many brothers, sisters, and nieces and nephews. Lost count of them. Yes. Other than that, I think we can start. How about we start with that most spectacular of things? The longest joke in the world. You ever read this joke, Douglas? Well, Cardbox, I assume you're still hiding around here somewhere. I tend to do that. I talk directly to whoever's last talked to me. Hour. Oh well. Longest joke in the world. It begins... It's called Lost in the Desert, and it begins thusly. So there's a man crawling through a desert. He decided he'd try his SUV in a little bit of cross-country travel. Had great fun zooming over the badlands and through the sand. Got lost, hit a big rock, and then couldn't get it to start again. There were no cell phone towers anywhere near, so his cell phone was useless. He had no family, his parents had died a few years before in an auto accident, and his few friends had no idea he was out here. He stayed in his car for a day or so, smart idea, but his one bottle of water ran out, and he was getting thirsty. He thought maybe he knew the direction back, now that he'd paid attention to the sun, and thought he'd figured out which way was north. So, he decided to start walking. Not a good idea in a desert. He figured he only had about to go 30 miles or so, and he'd be back in the small town he got gas at last. He thinks about walking at night to avoid the heat and sun, but based upon about how dark it actually was the night before, and given that he has no flashlight, he was afraid that he'll break a leg or step on a rattlesnake. So, he puts some sunscreen blocker on, puts the rest in his pocket for reapplication later, brings an umbrella he had in the back of the SUV with him to give him a little shade, pours the windshield wiper fluid onto his water bottle in case he gets desperate, brings his pocket knife if he finds a cactus that looks like it might have water in it, and heads out the direction he thinks that is right. He walks the entire day, but by the end of the day he's really thirsty, and he's been sweating all day. His lips are starting to crack. He's reapplied the sunblock twice, and tried to stay under the umbrella, but he still feels sunburned. The windshield wiper fluid sloshing in the bottle in his pocket is really getting tempting now. He knows that it's mainly water and some ethanol and coloring, but he also knows that they add some kind of poison to keep people from drinking it. Wonders what the poison is, and whether the poison would be worse than dying of thirst. He pushes on, trying to get to that small town before dark. By the end of the day, he starts getting worried. He's been walking out at least 3 miles an hour, according to his watch, for over 10 hours. That means if his estimate was right, he should be close to this town. He doesn't recognize any of this. He had to cross a dry creek bed a mile or two back, and he doesn't remember coming through it in the SUV. He figures that maybe he get his direction off just a little, and that the dry creek bed was just off to one side of his path. He tells himself that he's close, and that after dark he'll start seeing the town's lights over one of these hills. And that'll be all he needs. As it gets dim enough that he starts stumbling over small rocks and things, he finds a spot to sit down and wait for the full dark and the town lights. Full dark comes before he knows it. He must have dozed off. He stands back up, turns all the way around, and sees nothing but stars. He wakes up the next morning feeling absolutely lousy. His eyes are gummy, and his mouth and nose feel like they're full of sand. So thirsty that he can't even swallow. Barely got any sleep because he was cold, and he'd forgotten how cold it got at night in the desert, and hadn't noticed the night before because he'd been in his car. He knows the rule of 3, 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. Some people can make it a little longer in the best situations, but the desert heat and having to walk around and sweat isn't the best situation to be without water. He figures, unless he finds water, this'll be his last day. He rinses his mouth out with a little bit of windshield wiper fluid. He waits a while after spitting that little bit out to see if his mouth goes numb, or he feels dizzy or something. Has his mouth gone numb? Is it just in his mind? He's not sure. He'll go a little farther, and if he still doesn't find water, he'll try drinking some of the fluid. Then he has to face his next, harder question. Which way does he go from here? Does he keep walking the same way he was yesterday, assuming that he still knows which way that is? Or does he try a new direction? He has no idea what to do. Looking at the hills and dunes around him, he thinks he knows the direction he was heading before. Just by going by feeling, he points himself somewhat to the left of that and starts walking. As he walks, the day starts heating up. The desert, too cold just a couple of hours ago, soon becomes an oven again. He sweats a little at first, and then he stops. He starts getting worried. At that, when you stop sweating, he knows that means you're in trouble, usually right before heat stroke. He decides that it's time to try the windshield wiper fluid. Mystical. He can't wait any longer, and if he passes out, he's dead. Stops in the shade on a large rock, and takes the bottle out, opens it, and takes a mouthful. He slowly swallows it, making it last as long as he can. It feels so good in his dry and cracked throat. He doesn't even care about the nasty taste. Takes another mouthful, makes it last too. Slowly, he drinks half a bottle. Ah, this guy knows how to drink water after being dehydrated for a long time. You do drink it slowly. He figures that since he's drinking it, he might as well drink enough to make some difference to keep himself from passing out. He's quit worrying about the denaturing of the wiper fluid. If it kills him, it kills him. If he didn't drink it, he'd die anyway. Besides, he's pretty sure whatever substance they denature the fluid with is just designed to make you sick. Their way of keeping winners from buying cheap wiper fluid for the ethanol content. Can handle throwing up, if it comes to that. I've met quite a few people who drink methanol. Poor fellas. He walks in the hot, dry, windless desert. Sand, rocks, hills, dunes, the occasional scrawny cactus or dry bush. No sign of water, though. Sometimes he'll see a little movement on one side or the other, but whatever moved is usually gone before he can focus his eyes on it. Probably birds or mice or maybe snakes, but they usually move at night. Careful to stay away from the movements. After a while, he begins to stagger. He's not sure if it's fatigue, heat stroke finally catching up to him. Maybe he was wrong, or the denaturing of the wiper fluid was worse than he thought. He tries to steady himself, and keeps going. After more walking, he comes to a large stretch of land. Sand. This is good. He knows he passed over a stretch of sand in the SUV. He remembers doing donuts in it. Or at least he thinks he remembers it. He's getting woozy enough and tired enough that he's not sure if he remembers any of it. He's hallucinating. Or if he's hallucinating. But he thinks he remembers it. So, he heads off onto it, trying to get to the other side, hoping that it'll get him closer to the town. He was heading to the town, wasn't he? He thinks he was. He wasn't too sure anymore. He's not even sure how long he's been walking. Is it still morning, or is it moved to afternoon and the sun is going down? It must be afternoon. It seems that it's been too long since he started out. He walks through the sand. After a while, he becomes to a big dune in the sand. This is bad. He doesn't remember any dunes when he was driving over on the sand in his SUV. Or at least, he doesn't think he remembers any. This is bad. But he has no other direction to go. Too late to turn back now. He figures that he'll get to the top of the dune and see if anything from there helps him get to town. Keeps going up the dune. Halfway up, he slips in bad footing in the sand, the second or third time, and falls to his knees. He doesn't feel like getting up. He'll just fall down again. So he keeps going up the dune on his hands and his knees. While crawling, if his throat weren't so dry, he'd laugh. He's finally got to the hackneyed image of a man lost in the desert, crawling through the sand on his hands and his knees. It would be the perfect image, he imagines, if only his clothes were more ragged. People in the desert, in the cartoons, always had ragged clothes, but his have lasted without any rips so far. Somebody will probably find his desiccated corpse, half buried in the sand years from now, and his clothes will be still in fine shape. Shake the sand out, give it a good wash, and they'd be wearable again. He wishes his throat were wet enough to laugh. He coughs a little instead, and it hurts. Finally, he makes it to the top of the sand dune, and now he's at the top. He struggles a little, but manages to stand up and look around. All he sees is sand. Look at that, more sand. Behind him, about a mile away, he thinks he sees the rocky ground. He left ahead to this sand. Ahead of him, more dunes, more sand. This isn't where he drove his SUV. This is hell. Or close enough. Again, he doesn't know what to do. He decides to drink the rest of the wiper fluid while figuring it out. He takes the bottle, removes the cap, and when he glances to the side, he sees something. Something in the sand. Bottom of the dune, off to the side, he sees something strange. It's a flat area in the sand. He stops taking the cap off the bottle and tries to look closer. The area seems to be circular. And it's dark, darker than the sand. And there seems to be something in the middle of it, but he can't tell what it is. Looks as hard as he can, but he can still tell from here. He's going to go down there and have a look. He puts his bottle back in his pocket and starts to stumble down the dune. After a few steps, he realizes he's in trouble. He's not going to be able to keep his balance. After a few sliding, tottering steps, he falls and starts to roll down the dune. The sand, so hot, hits his body that for a minute he thinks he's caught fire on the way down, like a movie at a car wreck, crashing into flames as it falls over the cliff before it even hits the ground. He closes his mouth and eyes. He covers his face with his hands and waits for this to stop rolling. He stops at the bottom of the dune. After about a minute or two, he finds enough energy to sit up and get the sand out of his face and his clothes. When he clears his eyes enough, he looks around to make sure that the dark spot in the sand is still there, and he hadn't just imagined it. So, seeing the large, flat, dark spot on the sand is still there, he begins to crawl toward it. He gets up and walks towards it, but doesn't seem to have any energy to get up and walk right now. He must be in the final stages of dehydration. He figures as he crawls, if this place in the sand doesn't have water, he'll likely never make it anywhere else. This is his last chance. He gets closer and closer. He cannot see what's in the middle of the dark area. His eyes won't quite focus anymore for some reason. Lifting up his head to look, takes so much effort, then he gives up trying. He just keeps crawling. Finally, he reaches an area that he'd seen from the dune. It takes him about a minute of crawling on it before he realizes that he's no longer on sand. He's crawling on some sort of dark rock. Stone with some sort of marking on it, a pattern cut into the stone. He's too tired to stand up and see what the pattern is, so he keeps crawling. Crawls towards the center where his blurry eyes see something in the middle of the stone area. His mind, detached in a strange way, notes that either his hands and knees are so burnt by the sand that they no longer feel pain, or this dark stone in the middle of the desert, a burning desert, with a pounding, punishing sun overhead, does not seem to be hot. It almost feels cool. He considers lying down it. The nice, cool surface. Cool, dark stone, not a good sign. He must be hallucinating this. He's probably in the middle of a patch of sand or lying face down, just imagining this whole thing. A desert mirage. Soon, beautiful women carrying pitchers of water will come up and start giving him a drink. Then he'll know he's gone. He decides against laying down on the stone. If he's going to die here in the middle of a hallucination, he at least wants to see what's in the center before he goes. So he keeps crawling. It's the third time that he hears a voice before he realizes that what he's hearing. He could swear that someone just said, "Greetings, traveler. You do not look well. Do you hear me?" He stops crawling. Tries to look up from where he is and on his hands and knees, but it's too much effort to lift his head, so he tries something different. He leans back and tries to sit up on the stone. After a few seconds, he catches his balance, avoids falling on his face, sits up, tries to focus his blurry eyes. Blurry, he rubs his eyes with the back of his hand, and tries again. Oh, better this time. Yep, he can see. He's sitting in the middle of a large, flat, dark expanse of stone. Directly next to him, about 3 feet away, is a white post, or pole, about 2 inches in diameter, sticking up about 4 or 5 feet, out of the stone, at an angle, and wrapped around this white rod, a tail with a rattle on it, hovering and seeming to be ready to start rattling, is what must be a 15-foot-long desert diamondback rattlesnake, looking directly at him. Stares at the snake in shock. Doesn't have the energy to get up and run away. He doesn't even have the energy to crawl away. This is it. His final resting place. No matter what happens, he is not going to be able to move from this spot. Well, at least dying from a bite from this monster should be quicker than dying of thirst. He'll face his end like a man. He struggles up to sit a little straighter. Snake keeps watching him. He lifts one hand and waves in the snake's direction, feebly. The snake watches the hand for a moment, then goes back to watching the man, looking into his eyes. Maybe the snake had no interest in biting him. Hadn't rattled yet. That was a good sign. Maybe he wasn't going to die of snake bite after all. Then he remembered that he'd looked up when he'd reached the center because he thought he'd heard a voice. Still very woozy. He was likely to pass out soon. Sun still beat down on him, even though he was on the cool stone. He still didn't have anything to drink, but maybe he actually heard a voice. This stone didn't look natural, nor did that white post sitting from the stone. Someone had to have built this. Maybe they were nearby. Maybe that was who talked to him. Maybe this snake was even their pet, and that's why it wasn't biting. He tried to clear his throat to say hello, but his throat was too dry. All that comes out is a coughing or wheezing sound. There is no way he's going to be able to talk without something to drink. He feels his pocket. The wiper fluid is still there. He pulls the bottle out shakily, almost losing his balance and falling on the back in the process. This isn't good. He doesn't have much time left, by his reckoning, before he passes out. A journey, this joke. Gets the lid off the bottle, manages to get the bottle to his lips, and pours some of the fluid into his mouth. It sloshes around, and he swallows it. He coughs a little. His throat feels better. Maybe he can talk now. Tries again, ignoring the stick. Turns around to look around him, hoping to spot the owner of this place, and croaks out, "Hello? Is there anyone here?" He hears from his side, Greetings. What is it that you want? He turns his head back toward the snake. That's where the sound had seemed to come from. The only thing he can think of is that there must be a speaker hidden under the snake, maybe built into that post. He tries to ask for help. Please, he croaks suddenly, again feeling dizzy. I'd love not to be thirsty anymore. I've been a long time without water. Can you help me? Looking in the direction of the snake, hoping to see where the voice was coming from. This time, he's shocked to see the snake rear back, open its mouth, and speak. He hears it say as the dizziness overtakes him, and he falls forward, face first on the stone. Very well. Coming up. A piercing pain shoots through his shoulder, and suddenly he is awake. He sits up and grabs his shoulder, wincing at the throbbing pain. He is momentarily disoriented, as he looks around and remembers the crawl across the sand, the dark area, the stone, the snake. He sees the snake still wrapped around the tilted white post, still looking at him. He reaches up and feels his shoulder where it hurts. It feels slightly wet. He pulls his finger away and looks at them. Blood. He feels his shoulder again. His shirt has what feels like two holes in it. Two puncture holes. They match up with the two aching spots of pain on his shoulder. He's been bitten by the snake. He'll feel better in a minute. He looks up. It's the snake talking. He hadn't dreamed it. Suddenly he notices he's not dizzy anymore. And more importantly, he's not thirsty anymore at all. Have I died? Is this the afterlife? Why are you biting me in the afterlife? I'm sorry about that, but I had to bite you, said the snake. That's how I work. It all comes through the bite. Think of it as natural medicine. You bit me to help me. Why aren't I thirsty anymore? Did you give me a drink before you bit me? Hadn't I drank enough while I was unconscious not to be thirsty anymore? I haven't had a drink in well over 2 days. Well, except for the windshield wiper fluid. Hold it. How the world does a snake talk? Real? Some sort of Disney animation? No, says the snake. I'm real as you or anyone is, anyway. I don't give it. You will drink, I bit you. That's how it works. It's what I do. I have a bite. I don't have hands to give you a drink, and even if I had water just sitting around here. The man was stunned for a minute. There he was, sitting in the middle of a desert in some strange stone that should be hot but wasn't, talking to a snake that could talk back and just had bitten him. And he felt better. Not great, he was still starving, exhausted, but much better. He was no longer thirsty. He had started to sweat again, but only slightly. He felt quite hot in the sun, but it was starting to get lower in the sky, and the cool stone beneath him was a relief that he could notice that it was no longer dying of thirst. I might suggest we take care of that methanol you now have in your system with the next request, continued the snake. I can guess why you drank it, but I'm not sure how much you drank, or how much methanol was left in the wiper fluid. That stuff is nasty. It'll make you go blind in a day or two if you drink enough of it. Next request? Said the man. Put his hand on the back of his hurting shoulder and backed away from the snake a little. That's the way it works. If you'd like, that is, explained the snake. You get 3 requests. Call them wishes, if you wish. The great snake grinned at his own joke. And the man drew back a little further from the show of fangs. But there are rules, continued the snake. The first request is free. The second requires an agreement of secrecy. The third, the binding of responsibility. Snake looks at the man seriously. By the way, the snake says suddenly, my name is Nathan. Old Nathan. Samuel used to call me. He gave me that name. Before that, most of the bound used just to call me Snake. But that got old, and Samuel wouldn't stand for it. He said that anything that could be talk needed a name. He was big into names. You could call me Nate, if you wish. Again, the snake grinned. Sorry if I don't offer you a shake, but I think you can understand my shake sounds somewhat threatening. Snake gave a little rattle of his rattle a little shake. My name is Jack, said the man, trying to absorb all this. Jack Sampson. Can I ask you a question? Jack asked me. Suddenly, what happened to the poison in your bite? Why am I dying now? How did you do that? What do you mean by that's how that you work? That's more than one question, grins Nate, but I'll try and answer all of them. First, yes, you can ask me a question. The snake grins gets wider. Second, the poison in you it changed you. You no longer need to drink. Well, that's what you asked for. Well, technically you asked not to be thirsty anymore, but anymore is such a vague term. I decided to make it permanent. Now, as long as you live, you shouldn't need to drink much at all. Your body will conserve water very efficiently. You should be able to get just enough from the food you eat, much like a creature of the desert. You have been changed. For the third question, Nate continues, you are still dying. Besides the effect of the methanol in your system, you are a man, and men are mortal. In your current state, I give you no more than about another 50 years. Assuming you get out of this desert alive, that is. Nate seemed vastly amused at his own humour, and continued his wide grin. As for the fourth question, Nate said, looking more serious as far as Jack could tell, as Jack was now working with his ability to read talking snake emotions from a snake facial features. First, you have to agree to make a second request and become bound by the secrecy, or I can't tell you. Wait, choked Jack. Isn't this where you say you could tell me, but you have to kill me? I thought that was implied. Nate continued to look serious. Yeah. Jack leaned a little, as he remembered what he was talking to was a 15-foot poisonous reptile with a reputation for having a nasty temper. So, what is this bound by secrecy stuff? And can you really stop the effects of the methanol? Jack thought for a second. What do you mean methanol anyway? I thought these days they use ethanol in wiper fluid, and just denature it. They may. I don't really know. I haven't gotten out in a while. Maybe they do. All I know is that I smell methanol on your breath. That bottle in your pocket, and the colour of the blue liquid that you pulled out to drink. Let me guess that it was wiper fluid. I assume they still colour wiper fluid blue. Yeah, they do, said Jack. I figured, replied the snake. As for being bound by secrecy, with the fulfillment of your next request, you will be bound to say nothing about me, this place, or any information that I tell you after that when you decide to go out your kind. You won't be allowed to talk about me, write about me, use sign language, charades, or even act in a way that will lead someone to guess correctly about me. You'll be bound to secrecy. Of course, I'll also ask you to promise not to give me away, as I'm guessing that you're a man of the world. You'll never test the binding anyway, so you won't notice. Alas, Nate said the last part with utter confidence. Jack, who always had prided himself on being a man of his word, felt a little nervous at this. Hey, Nate, who are you? How do you know that? How are you, omniscient or something? Well, Jack, I can't tell you that, unless you make the second request. Nate looked away for a minute, then looked back. Well, okay, said Jack. What is this about a second request? What can I ask for you? For are you allowed to tell me that? Sure, said Nate brightly. You're allowed to ask for changes to yourself. They're like wishes, but they can only affect you. And before you ask, I can't give you immortality or omniscience. For that matter, although I may be able to give you gaseous to yet remain alive, and you could spread throughout the atmosphere and sort of be omnipresent, but what good would that do to you? You still wouldn't be able to be omniscient, and thus could only focus on one thing at a time. Not very useful, at least in my opinion. Nate stopped when he realized that Jack was staring at him. Well, anyway, continued Nate, I'd probably suggest giving you a permanent good health. It would negate the methanol in your system and you'd be immune to most poison and diseases. And you'd live a very long time. Barring accident, of course. And you'll even have a tendency to recover from accidents as well. It always seemed like a good choice of request to me. Cure the methanol poisoning, eh? And keep me healthier for a long time. Doesn't sound too bad at that. It has to be a request about to change to me. I can't ask to be rich, right? Because that's not really a change to me. Alright, noted Nate. Could I ask to be genius and permanently healthy? That makes 2 requests, Jack. Yeah, I figured so. But I could be a genius. I could become the smartest scientist in the world, or the best athlete. Well, I could make you very smart, admitted Jake, but that wouldn't necessarily make you the best scientist in the world, or I could make you very athletic. That wouldn't necessarily make you the best athlete either. You've heard the saying that 99% of a genius is hard work. Well, there's some truth to that. I could give you talent. But I can't make you work hard. It all depends on what you decide to do with it. Alright, I think I understand, and I get a 3rd request after this. Maybe, said Nate. Depends on what you decide then. There are more rules for the 3rd request that I can only tell you after the 2nd. You know how it goes. Nate looked like he had shrugged. If he had shoulders. Goodness, we're not even halfway through this. That is very itchy. Okay, well, since I'd rather not be blind in a day or 2, and permanent health doesn't sound too bad, then consider my 2nd request. Officially. Do I need to sign in blood or something? No, just hold out your hand. Morning next. We're partway through the longest joke. The world's longest joke. No, said Nate. Just hold out your hand. Or heel. Or whatever part you want me to bite. I have to bite you again. Like I said, that's how it works. The poison, you know. Nate said apologetically. Jack winced a little, and felt his shoulder where the last bite was. Hey, it didn't work anymore, just like Nate had said. Well, that made Jack feel better about the biting business, but still, standing still while a 15-foot snake sunk its fangs into you. Jack stood up, ignoring how good it felt to be able to stand again, and the hunger starting to gnaw at his stomach. Jack tried to decide where he wanted to get bitten. Despite knowing it wouldn't hurt for long, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Oh, Jack, Nate said suddenly, looking to the past Jack towards the dunes behind him. Is that someone up there coming over? Jack spun around and looked. Who else could it be, out here in the middle of nowhere? Did they bring food? Wait a minute, there was nobody over there. That was... Jack let out a bellow as he felt 2 fangs sink into his rear end. His jeans! Jack sat down carefully, favouring his more tender buttock. Would have decided eventually, Nate. I was just thinking about it. You didn't have to hoodwink me like that. I've been doing this a long time, Jack, Nate said confidently. You humans have a hard time sitting still and letting a snake bite you. Especially one of my size. Besides, I bet it's only been a couple of minutes and it doesn't hurt anymore, does it? That's because of the health benefit with this one. I told you it'd heal quickly now. Yeah, well, still, said Jack. It's the principle of the thing, and nobody likes being bitten in the butt. Couldn't you've got my calf or something instead? Or meat in the typical human butt, replied Nate. And less chance you'd accidentally kick me. I'll move at the last second. Yeah, right, so tell me of all these wonderful secrets that I now qualify to hear, answered Jack. Alright, said Nate. Do you want to ask questions first, or do you want me to start talking? Just talk, said Jack. I'll sit here and try and not think about food. They could rustle up some food for you first, if you'd like, answered Nate. Hey, you didn't tell me you had food around here? Nate? Jack jumped up. What do we have here? Am I walking distance to town, or can you magically whip up food along with your other pals? Jack was almost shouting in excitement. His stomach had been growling for hours. I was thinking more like I could flush something out of its hole and bite it for you, and you could skin it and eat it alive. Assuming you have a knife, that is, replied Nate, with a grin that Jack was starting to get used to. Jack biting, sitting back down. I think I'll pass. I can last a little longer before I get desperate enough to eat a desert rat or whatever you find out there. And there's nothing to burn. I'd have to eat it raw. No thanks, just talk. Okay, said Nate, still grinning. But I'd better hurry before you start looking at me as food. Nate reared back a little, looked around for a second, and continued. You, Jack? are sitting in the middle of the Garden of Eden. Jack looked around at the sand and the dunes, back at Nate, skeptically. Well, that's the best I can figure it anyway, Jack, said Nate. Stand up and look around at the symbol on the rock here. He gestured around at the dark stone they were sitting on with his nose. Jack stood up, looked down. Carved into the stone was a bas relief. In a bas relief was a large representation of a tree. The angled pole that Nate was wrapped around was coming out of the trunk of the tree. Right below where the main branches left the trunk to reach out across the stone, it was very well done. It looked more like a tree that had been reduced to 2 dimensions and embedded in the stone than it did a carving. Jack walked around and looked at the details in the fading light of the setting sun. He wished he'd looked at it while the sun was higher in the sky. Wait, the sun was setting. Means he was going to spend another night out here. Jack looked out across the desert a little bit and came back and stood next to Nate. In all the excitement, I almost forgot, Nate, said Jack. Which way is the town, and how far am I going to get eventually to head back? I'm not sure I'll be able to survive eating raw desert critters for that long. And even if I can, I'm not sure I'll want to. Oh, it's about 30 miles that way, Nate pointed, with a rattle on his tail this time. As far as Jack could tell, it was the direction at right angles the way he'd been going when he was crawling here. But that's 30 miles by the way the crow flies. It's about 40 the way the man walks. You should be able to do it in about half a day with your improved endurance, if you head out early tomorrow. Jack looked out the way the snake had pointed for a few seconds more, and then sat down. It was getting dark. Not much about he could do about the heading out right now, and besides, Nate was just about to get to the interesting stuff. Garden of Eden. As best as you can figure it. Well, yes, as best as I and Samuel could figure it anyway, said Nate. He figured that the story just got a little mixed up, you know. Snake in a tree, offering temptations, making bargains, that sort of stuff. But he never quite figured out how the Hebrews found about this spot from across the ocean. Worried about that for a while. Garden of Eden, huh? Said Jack. How long have you been here, Nate? No idea, really. It's a long time. It never occurred to me to count the years until recently. But by then, of course, it was too late. I do remember when this whole place was green, so I figured it'd been about thousands of years at least. So, you are the snake that tempted Eve, said Jack. Beats me, said Nate. Maybe I can't remember the first one of you that I talked to was female or not, and I never got a name, but it could have been. And I suppose she could have considered my offer to grant a request a temptation. Though I've rarely had refusals. Oh, how did you get here? Why is that white pole stuck out of the stone there? Asked Jack. Dad left me here. Or I assume it was my dad. It was another snake, much bigger than I was. I was talking about him, but I don't remember if it was in a language or some sort of understanding of what he wanted. But one day, he brought me to the stone, told me about it, and asked me to do something for him. I talked over and over with him for a while, and agreed. I've been here ever since. What is this place? Said Jack. What did he ask you to do? Well, you see, this pole sticking out of here, out of the stone. Nate loosened his claws around the tilted white pole and showed Jack where it descended into the stone. The pole was tilted about 45-degree angle, and seemed to enter the stone at an 18-inch slot cut into the stone. Jack leaned over, and the slot was dark, and the pole went as far as Jack could see in the dim light. Jack reached out to touch the pole, but Nate was suddenly in the way. You can't touch that yet, Jack. Why not? I haven't explained it to you yet, replied Snake. Well, it looks like a lever or something. Push it that way, and it would move in the slot. Yep, that is what it is. What does it do? Asked Jack. End the world? Oh no, Snake said. Nothing drastic like that. It just ends humanity. I call it the lever of doom. The last few words, Nate had used a deeper, ringing voice. He tried to look serious for a few seconds, then gave up and grinned. Jack initially was startled by Nate's pronouncement, but when Jake grinned, Jack laughed. Ha! You almost had me there fooled for a second there. What does it really do? Oh, it really ends humanity. Like I said, I just thought the voice I used was funny, didn't you? Excuse me. No. Nate continued to grin. A lever to end humanity, asked Jack. What the world is that for? Why would anyone need to end humanity? Oh, replied Nate. I get the idea that maybe humanity was an experiment, or maybe the big guy just thought that humanity started going really bad. There should be a way to end it. I'm not really sure. All I know, there are rules and guesses that Samuel and I had about why it's here. I didn't ask it back when I started here. Rules? What rules? The rules that are I can't tell anyone about it or let them touch it unless they agree to be bound by secrecy. And only one human can be bound in that way at a time. That's it. Jack looked somewhat shocked. You mean I could pull the lever now? You'd let me end humanity? Yep. If you want to. Nate looked at Jack carefully. You want to, Jack? No, said Jack, stepping back a little. Why in the world would anyone want to end humanity? It'd take a psychotic to want that. Or worse, a suicidal psychotic, because it would kill him too, wouldn't it? Yep. He'd be human too. Has anyone seriously considered it? Any of those bound to secrecy, that is? Well, girls, I think they've all seriously considered it at one time or another. Being given that sort of responsibility makes you sit down and think, so I'm told. Samuel considered it several times. He often got disgusted with humanity. He'd come after you, just hold the level for a while. He never pulled it. Well, I guess you wouldn't be here if he did. Nate grinned some more. Jack sat down, well back from the lever. He looked thoughtful and puzzled at the same time. After a bit, he said, so this makes me the judge of humanity. I get to decide whether they keep going or it just ends me. That seems to be it, agreed Nate. What kind of criteria do I use to decide, said Jack. How do I make this decision? Am I supposed to decide if they're good, or too many of them, or they're going the wrong way, or they're a set of rules? Nope. Pretty much have to decide on your own. It's up to you. However you want to decide, I guess you just have to know. What if I get mad at someone? Some girl dumps me. And I feel horrible. Couldn't I just make a mistake? How do I know that I won't screw up? Nate gave his snake-like shrug again. You don't? Just have to try your best. Ah, good advice. Jack sat there for a while, staring off into the desert that was rapidly getting dark, chewing on a fingernail. Suddenly, the snake turned around and looked. Jack turned around and looked at the snake. Nate, was the Sentinel the one bound to this before me? Yes. Nate replied Nate. He was a good guy. Talked to me a lot. Taught me about to read and brought me books. I think I have a good pile of them buried on the sand somewhere here. I still miss him. Died a few months ago. Sounds like a good guy. How did you handle this when you first told him? What did he do? Well, he sat down for a while, thought about it for a bit, and asked me some questions, much like what you're doing. What did he ask you, if you're allowed to tell me? He asked me about the third request. Aha! It was Jack that turned to a grin, and what did you tell him? I told him the rules for the third request. At the third request, you have to agree to this whole thing, that if it ever comes to the point where you really think you should end humanity, that you come here and end it. You want to avoid it, you want to whip out. And you will be bound to do it too, Jack. Jack looked out into the darkness for a while, Nate watching him, waiting. Nate, Jack said quietly eventually, did Samuel ask for with his third request? Nate sounded like he was grinning as he replied, Wisdom, Jack. He asked for wisdom, much as I could give him. Okay, Jack said suddenly, standing up and facing away from Nate. Give it to me. Nate looked at Jack's backside. Give you what, Jack? Give me the wisdom. The same that Samuel asked for. Help him, maybe it'll help me too. It did help him, right? He said it did, replied Nate, but he seemed a little quieter after, and he had a lot to think about. Well, yeah, I could see that. So give it to me. Turned away from Nate, Panto slightly raised up, tensed up. Nate watched Jack tense up with a little exasperation. If he bit Jack now, Jack would likely jump out of his skin. Maybe hurt both of them. You remember that you'll be bound to destroy humanity if it ever looks like it needs it. Right, Jack? Asked Nate, shifting position. Yeah, I got that, replied, eyes squeezed tightly shut and body tense. Not noticing the change in direction of Nate's voice. And, continued Nate from his new position, you remember that you turn bright purple and grow big horns and extra eyes. Yeah, hey, wait a minute! Jack opening his eyes, straightening up, turning around. Purple? He didn't see Nate out. With the moonlight, Jack could see that the lever extended from its slot in the rock without the snake wrapped around it. Jack heard from behind him. Just kidding. Right before he felt a now familiar piercing pain. This time, he got the other buttock. Jack sat on the edge of the dark stone, the rapidly cooling air. His feet extending out to the sand, he stared into the darkness, listening to the wind stir the sand, occasionally rubbing his butt where he had been recently bitten. Oh, we're a bit past halfway now. Nate had left for a little while. Comes back with a desert-shaped, rodent-shaped bulge somewhere in his middle, and was now wrapped around the lever, his tongue flicking out into the desert. Only sign that he was still awake. Occasionally, Jack, with his toes absent-mindedly digging in the sand while he thought, would ask Nate a question without turning around. Nate, do accidents count? Nate lifted his head a little. What do you mean? You know, accidents. If I accidentally fall on the lever without meaning to, does that still wipe out humanity? Pretty sure it does, and I'd suggest you be careful about that if you start feeling wobbly. Nate said with some amusement. A little later. Does it have to be me that pulls the lever? Asked Jack. That's the rule, Jack. Nobody else can pull it, answered Nate. No. I mean that it has to be my hands. Could I pull it with a rope, or push it with a stick, or throw a rock? Yes, those should work, though I'm not sure how complicated you get. Samuel thought about trying to build some sort of remote device for once, but gave up. Everything he built would be gone by the next sunrise if it was touching the stone or over it. He told me that in the past others had been bound to try and bury the leather so they wouldn't be tempted to pull it. But every time the stones or the sand had disappeared. Wow, Jack said. Cool. Jack leaned on his back until his elbows kept him from the stone, and looked up into the sky. Height! How long did Samuel live? Was one of his wishes for health too? Asked Jack. Yes, he lived to 167 years, Jack. 67 years, that's almost 140 more years than I'll live if I live as long. Do you know what he died of, Jack? He died of getting tired of living, Jack. Nate said, sounding somewhat tired. Jack turned his head to look at Nate in the starlight. Nate looked back. Samuel knew he wasn't going to be able to stay in society. He figured that they'd eventually see him alive and start questioning it, so he decided he'd have to disappear for a while. Faked his death once, but changed his mind. Too early, and he could stay a little longer. He was very fond of mankind. He wasn't very fond of mankind, but he liked the attention. Most of the time, anyway. His daughter and his wife dying almost did him in, though. He didn't stay in society much longer after that. He eventually came out here to spend time talking to me and thinking about pulling the lever. A few months ago, he told me he had enough. It was his time. And then he died? Just like that? Nate shook his head a little. He made his fourth request, Jack. There's only one thing you can ask for the fourth request. The last bite. After a bit, Nate continued. He told me he was tired. And he reassured me that someone new would show up soon, as they always had. Nate finished after Samuel's boat disappeared off the stone with the sunrise. Jack laid back down and looked at the sky, leaving Nate alone with his memories. It had been a long time since Jack's breathing evened out into sleep. Jack woke with the next sunrise, and next morning. He was chilled in the air with the desert, but overall he was feeling pretty good. Well, except for his stomach grumbling, he wasn't willing to eat a raw desert rat. Good morning, Natsuki. We're leading the longest joke. So, after getting directions from the town to Nate, making sure he knew how to get back and reassuring Nate that he'd be back soon. Jack started the long walk back to town. With his new health and Nate's good directions, he made it back easily. Jack caught a bus back to the city, shut up for work the next day, a little worse for wear with a story about getting lost on the desert, black, and walking back out. Within this couple of days, Jack had talked his friends into a tow truck, getting the desert with the open so they can fetch his SUV. They found it after a couple of hours of searching and towed it back without incident. Jack was careful not even to look in Nate's directions, though their path didn't come within sight of it. Before the next weekend, Jack had gone a couple of stores, including a bookstore, got his SUV back from a mechanic, and warning them to avoid any more joyriding in the desert. On Saturday, Jack headed in to see Nate. Jack parked a little way from the small town near Nate, loaded up his new backpack with camping gear, things he was bringing for Nate, and then started walking. He figured that he would leave the least trail, and he knew that while many not people camped in the desert, it wasn't unheard of. It shouldn't really raise suspicions. Jack had brought many books for Nate. More recent magazines, newspapers, something that would catch Nate up on what was going on in the world. Others were just good books to read. He spent the weekend with Nate, and then headed out again, telling Nate that he'd be back there soon, but he had things to do first. Over 4 months later, Jack was back to see Nate again. This time he'd brought a laptop with him, specifically modified, had solar recharger, special filters to keep the sand out, a satellite link-up, and a special keyboard and joystick that Jack had hoped that 15-foot rattlesnake could be used. And it had been hacked to not give its location to the satellite. After that, Jack could email Nate to keep in touch, but he still visited him fairly regularly, at least once or twice a year. After the first year, Jack quit his job. For some reason, with the wisdom he'd been given, the knowledge that he could live for 150 years, working a 9-to-5 job for someone else didn't seem that worthwhile anymore. Jack went back to school. Eventually, Jack started writing, perhaps because of the wisdom, perhaps because of his new perspective. He wrote well. People liked what he wrote, and he became well known for it. After a time, Jack bought an RV and started travelling around the country for book signings and readings. He still remembered to drop by and visit Nate occasionally. One of the visits, Nate seemed quieter than usual. Not that Nate had been fond of the fountain, but Nate had been a fountain of joy lately. Jack's best guess was Nate was still missing Samuel, and though Jack had tried, he hasn't been able to replace Samuel in Nate's eyes. Nate had been quieter and quieter on each visit, but this visit, Nate didn't even speak when Jack walked out to the lever. He nodded at Jack and went back to staring into the desert. Jack, respecting Nate's silence, sat down and waited. After a few minutes, Nate spoke. Jack, I have someone to introduce to you. Looked surprised. Someone to introduce me to? Nate looked around and looked back carefully at Nate. This is something to do with the big guy. No. This is more personal. I want you to meet my son. Nate looked over the nearest sand dune and said, Sammy. Jack watched as a 4-foot-long desert rattlesnake crawled from behind the dune up to the stone base of the lever. Yo, Jack, said the new, much smaller snake. Yo, Sammy, said Jack. Jack looked at Nate. Named after Samuel, I presume. Nate nodded. Jack, I've got a favour to ask you. Could you show Sammy around for me? Nate unwrapped himself from the lever and slid over the edge of the stone. When Samuel first told me about the world, he brought me books and pictures. I wished I could go see it. I wanted to see the great forests, the canyons, the cities, or even the deserts. To see if they felt and smelled the same. I want my son to have that chance, to see the world, before he becomes bound here like I have been. He's seen it in pictures over the computer that you brought me, but I hear it's not the same. That being there is different. I want you to have him to have that. You think you can do that for me, Jack? Jack nodded. Obviously very important to Nate, so Jack didn't even joke about taking a talking rattlesnake out into the world. Yeah, I could do that for you, Nate. Is that all you need? Jack could sense it was something more. Nate looked at Sammy. Sammy looked at Nate for a second, then said, Oh yeah, gotta pack. Be back in a bit, Jack. Nice to meet you. Sammy slithered over the dune and out of sight. Nate watched Sammy disappear and then looked at Jack. Jack, this is my first son, my first offspring. For all these years, you don't even know what it took for me to find a mate. Nate grinned to himself. But anyway, I had a son for a reason. I'm tired. I'm ready for it to be over. I needed a replacement. So, you're ready to see the world and wanted to take over the level while you were gone? Jack, you're a better guesser than that. You've already figured it out. I'm bound here. There's only one way to leave, and I'm ready. It's my time to die. Jack looked at him more closely. He could tell that Nate had thought about this, probably for quite a while. Jack had trouble imagining what it would be like to be as old as Nate. But Jack could already tell that another 200 years, he might be getting tired of life himself. Jack could understand Samuel's decision, and now I understand Nate's. So all Jack said was, "What do you want me to do?" Thanks, Jack. I only wanted two things. One, show Sammy around the world. Let him get his fill until he's ready to come back here and take over. Two, give me the fourth request. I can't just decide to die. Not any more than you can. I won't even die of old age like you eventually will, even though it'll be a long time from now. I need to be killed. Once Sammy is back here, ready to take over, I'll be able to die, and I need you to kill me. I've thought about how poisons and other drugs won't work. I've seen pictures of snakes that were shot and some of them alive for days. That's out too, so I want you to bring back a sword. Going to look at the dune that Sammy had gone behind. I'd say an axe, but that's somewhat undignified, putting my head on the ground and chopping block. No, I like a sword. A time-honored way of going out, a dignified way to die. And more importantly, it should work even on me. Are you willing to do that for me, Jack? Nate turned back to look at Jack. Yeah, Nate replied Jack solemnly. I think I can handle that. Nate replied, nodded. Good! Turned back toward the dune and shouted, Sammy! Jack's about to leave, and quietly said, Thank you, Jack. Jack didn't have to say anything after that, so he waited for Sammy to make it back to him in the lever. He nodded to him, nodded a final time at Nate, and headed into the desert with Sammy following. Over the next several years, Sammy and Jack kept in touch with Nate through email as they went about their adventures. They made a goal of visiting every country, and did a respectable job of it. Sammy had a natural gift for languages, as Jack expected he would. He even ended up as acting as a translator for Jack in a few countries. Jack managed to keep the talking rattlesnake hidden, even so. By the time they were nearing the end of their tour of countries, Sammy had been spotted a few times. While several people had been enough to startle them greatly, nobody had enough evidence to prove anything. And with a few wild rumors and stories that followed Jack and Sammy around, nothing ever hit the newspapers, or public in general. When they had finished their tour of the countries, Jack suggested that they try some undersea diving, and they did. Spelunking, they did that too. Sammy finally drew the line at visiting Antarctica. He'd come to realize that Jack was stalling. After talking to his dad about over email, he figured that Jack probably didn't want to have to kill Nate. Nate told Sammy that humans could be squeamish about killing friends or acquaintances. So Sammy eventually put his tail down, as he doesn't have a foot, and told Jack it was the time. It was ready to go back and take up his duties from his dad. Jack delayed it a little more by insisting they go back to Japan and buy an appropriate sword. He even stretched it a little more by getting lessons to how to use the sword. Eventually, he'd learned as much he was likely to without dedicating his life to it, and was confident enough to take the head of a snake. It's time to head back and see Nate. They go back to the US. Jack got out the old RV in storage and loaded up Sammy and the sword, and they'd head it for the deserts. When they got to the small town Jack had been trying to find those years ago, when he'd met Nate, Jack was in a funk. He didn't really feel like walking out all the way out there. Not only that, but he'd forgotten to figure the travel time correctly. It was late afternoon. They'd either have to spend the night in the town, or walk out tomorrow, and walk in the dark. As Jack was afraid that if he waited one more night he might lose his resolve, he decided he'd drive the RV out there. It was only going to be his once, and Jack would go back and cover his tracks afterwards. They ought to be able to make it out there at nightfall, and they drove, and could get it over with tonight. Jack told Sammy to email Nate that they were coming as he drove out of sight of the town and on the road. They pulled off the road and headed into the desert. Everything went well until the sand dunes. Jack had been nursing the RV along the whole time, over rocks, trees, creek beds, revving the engine a few times when they got stuck. When they came to the dunes, Jack didn't really think about it, just downshafted and headed up the first one. By the third one, Jack had started to regret. He decided to drive on the sand. RV was fishtailing and losing traction. Jack was having to work each dune slowly and was trying to keep from losing control each time they came over the top and slid down the other side. Sammy in the passenger seat, coiled up and laughing at Jack's driving. They came into the top of the fourth dune, the biggest one yet, saw that his final destination, the stone, the lever, and somewhere, Nate, waited below. Jack put on the brakes, and he'd gone a little too far. The RV started slipping on the other side. Jack started turning the wheel, but he didn't have enough traction. He pumped the brakes, no response. They started sliding down the hill, faster and faster. Jack felt as a shock go through him. He looked down. The RV was directly on a course for it. If Jack didn't do something, the RV would hit it. He was about to end humanity. Jack steered more frantically, trying to get traction. It still wasn't working. The dune was too steep, the sand too loose. For a split second, Jack realized that his only chance would be once he hits the stone around the lever. He should have traction just a second before he hit the lever. He wouldn't have time to stop, but he should be able to steer away. Jack took a better grip on the steering wheel, tried to turn the RV a little bit. Every little bit would help. He'd have enough time just to turn just right. The RV got to the bottom of the dune, sliding at amazing speed. Just before he reached the stone across, he checked that they were still heading for the lever. They were, but Jack noticed something else. Top of the dune, Nate wasn't wrapped around the lever. He was off to the side, but still on the stone, waiting for them. The problem was, he was waiting on the same side of the lever that Jack had picked to steer toward. RV was already starting to drift that way a little in its mad rush across the sand. There was no way Jack was going to be able to turn around the lever the other way. So, he had an instant realization. He's either going to have to hit the lever or run over Nate. He glanced over at Sammy and saw that Sammy had realized the same thing. Jack took a firmer grip on the steering wheel as the RV ran up on the stone. Shouting to Sammy, he pulled the steering wheel. Better Nate than lever. He ran over the snake. And such ends the longest joke. All that. Goodness gracious. And there we are, everyone. Better Nate than lever. This is the second time I've read this joke, so I already knew it. There is a funny little story about this joke. It's actually a type of personality test. It was used in a thesis. That took like an hour. It did. It's actually a personality test. Or at least was used as a type of personality test by a master's student. A psychology master's student, yes. An hour-long joke. It is the longest joke in the world. But hey, I got through it. That's why it said in the description of this stream, if we have enough time after the longest joke. It was a long joke. A lot faster to read yourself, but... But yes, the people would read the joke, or they'd be given this story, and afterwards they would take a questionnaire on how they reacted to it. And there were three main groups that came out of it. About 11% see this page, took their time, enjoying the joke as they read it, build up the punchline, and even if the punchline wasn't great, and it wasn't, they intended to enjoy the process. Half begin to scroll down to either the punchline before starting to read, or within a short time, usually 20 seconds or less. The vast majority of this group chose not to read the joke. And 30% read at least one third of the joke with the intention of reading it all, but then question their decision, investment of time they are making, and go back and forth between deciding or to continue or skipping to the end. This may happen unconsciously or a couple of moments. The vast majority of this group give up before finishing half the joke and scroll to the end. So yes, and it talks about the personality traits that have reacted to those three groups. Disclaimer: this summary is not a thesis intended to offer advice or therapy, nor is it intended to infer anything about whether anyone reading this page does or does not fit the personalities described. This ends the longest joke in the world, more than 42 meters long, top to bottom. The world's longest joke was 42 meters long. Interesting, isn't it? I read it once years ago, and I did read it all, so I'm part of the 11%, and now you all are too, mostly because I forced you, Clockwork Orange style, to sit in a chair and listen to me do the story. It was a good story though, well written. I was invested. How were you all enjoyed? Were you all invested in the story of Nate, the snake of the Garden of Eden? I think it was quite a fun story. A very fun story. Anyone got any suggestions of things I should read next? Perhaps a funny meme or something? There are some memes out there, aren't there? Readable memes. I expected a twist that the last person was Samuel became the snake, or other possibilities. Yes, you got invested, didn't you? You were like, what's the mystery of these stories? But really, it was all about the punchline. I did start this with it being the longest joke in the world, and I did have a lot of humorous things in it, like the wiper fluid joke that kept continuing. It's in a magical world where wiper fluid existed. And not just something you do to your children or significant others who know very little about cars. Goodness gracious me. But yes. Now, what shall we do next? We've got the Loaded Dog from Henry Lawson. It's supposed to be humorous, but I suppose that is your opinion on, that was a long joke. Sure was. Should have done it for like a, what are those things, like a stretch goal or something. Don't you think? I should have done it for like some sort of 100 subscribers sort of thing, shouldn't I? But I love the thing, it's quite fun. I quite enjoy reading the joke, so I suppose I need to find something else to do for some 100 subscribers shenanigans. Because yes, how long have we been going? Took about an hour. Though reading it made me realise, bloody hell, I forgot how fast I read on my own. Because when you're reading for years like I have, and read since you were very young, you can scan quite quickly. I did forget it would be that long. It only took me about 30 minutes to read it. Probably took half the time when I was reading it without speaking, because you're much faster. But, did I read it well? Did I sound good? Did I add enough emotion to it all? Because, that was a journey. You seem good, thank you. Drink the rest of my tea. Ah, damn it, my tea is out. Should have brought a pot in here, shouldn't I? Well, we have The Loaded Dog to read, so I imagine you need a glass of water after that one. I was drinking tea throughout it. This one's shorter. The Loaded Dog is only a couple of pages long. Only about 4 pages long. And this book I've got here. I'm just gonna put on Twitter that I finally finished The Longest Joke. So, does anyone have any short story suggestions, or are we all just as clueless about short stories as I am? I never really read short stories, I read novels. Short stories really never came along my way. The rain has returned. I'll never get to mow the bloody lawn at this rate. Oh, goodness. A lot of people came by in that store. I originally wasn't looking. I really liked that picture, didn't they? Now. If nobody has anything, I'll just start reading The Loaded Dog. Are you ready for my terrible Australian accent? I'm Australian and I have a terrible Australian accent. Because yes, this sort of thing is fun. You see, I did a lot of this sort of reading for nieces and nephews. You read bedtime stories. Oh yeah, speaking of bedtime stories. And so I've read a lot of this sort of stuff. And now I'm doing it for my great nieces and great nephews. Well, my great nephew is quite young still, but my great niece is still likes to be read to. But I just realised something. Yesterday, I forgot to put the picture on the computer. But yesterday I had a little book appear in my mailbox. It said, "The Truth About Christmas," from the Australian Christian Lobby. It is, I believe, the Gospel according to Luke. You could always read that. Read the Bible. Start exorcising some demons by reading it in Latin. But I'll stay away from that for now. But yes, the world's longest joke. Very good. Oh. It's very nostalgic to read. Speaking of my greatness, I've never really talked about any of the stuff I did while I was at the wedding. Something really quite funny happened during the wedding. Speaking of children and marriage and the world's longest joke. Plot twist, it's me. I'm the world's oldest joke. Living, at least. I was a bit self-deprecating. But yes, I had a funny encounter that I feel like I should share. With, well, I was staying with my niece. She had a spare room that I was staying in when I was there for the wedding. And she runs a Bible study. She's still very Christian. To each their own, I suppose. There's a reason why I laughed at the Australian Christian lobby. But she runs a Bible study for a nearby Christian school. And so a lot of these girls and boys from the Christian school turned up to her house one day when I was sitting there, thinking, it's almost 5 o'clock. I should be drinking a bottle of G&T. Not a very good sign. And they all did their Bible studying things. And then afterwards they, my sister... I just got really confused. My sister's daughter... I don't know why I was going to say it like that. My sister's daughter, otherwise known as my niece, let them play on the play equipment, and I was sitting out there reading a book. And one of them came up to me and asked, "How old are you?" They didn't know. They didn't even ask my bloody name first. I was like, "Well, my name's Eric. What is your name?" They're like, "How old are you?" And I was like, old as the dinosaurs, I suppose? And they were like, Then they walked away. Now, these kids couldn't have been more than 14. Not too sure what they were doing. And that girl walked away, talked to her friends a bit, came back, walked up to me and went, "Are you married?" And I was like, "No. Lifetime bachelor? At your service?" And she walked away again. So she came back and she said, I'm gonna say a random name. Jane said that if you're that old, you should be married. I was like, well, I'm not. I'm not too sure what you're getting on at. And she was like, okay. If you're that old, you should be married. You really should be. And I was like, okay. I'll keep it in mind. And she walked away again. Went off and did things. And then eventually their parents turned up and were ready for them to go home, and they were saying goodbye to everyone, and they were like, oh yeah. And she came back up to me again, one more time, and said, "You should get married. Next time I see you, you should be married." I was like, what do you want from me, kid? Why do you keep saying I need to be married? I don't know what sure this kid's obsession with marriage was. I don't need you, 12-year-old child, to say when I should be married. I'll get married when I bloody well please. It was completely unprompted. She just walked up to me and thought that I was old enough to be married, and she was personally offended by the fact that I wasn't. I'll never understand what's going through her head. Perhaps one day I'll get to ask. But that was absolutely bizarre. Get married. You know, you get married. She sounded like a bloody mother-in-law, didn't she? Not mother-in-law, a grandmother. She seemed like a grandmother from a Christmas movie or a Thanksgiving movie. When are you getting married? When are we gonna have kids? You're the type. My family gave up to her for a certain while. They all just knew I had too stringent of a... What is the way, sir? Too stringent conditions, I suppose. But yes. Goodness, it is really bucketing down. Now, this last 30 minutes, how about we read The Loaded Dog? Sounds like my mum. Yes, I know, except this was some 12-year-old from a Bible study. I fear and worry for that person's children when they eventually become a parent. I worry. I truly do. Also, the utter balls on that child. The courage. Coming up to an old man. Grey hairs and imposing presence. Reading a book with a very intimidating title called Dogs and Demons. and just going, you should get married. You're not good enough because you're not married. Come on, if you're that old, you should be married. Goodness. You'd think I was some late 20s spinster. He's being told that she's going out of date. Good God. Well. Let us continue. This is by Henry Lawson. It's a short story called The Loaded Dog. Dave, Regan, Jim Bentley, and Andy Page were sinking a shaft in Stony Creek in search of a rich gold quartz reef which was supposed to exist in the vicinity. There's always a rich reef that is supposed to exist in the vicinity. The only question is whether it is 10 feet or hundreds of feet beneath the surface. And in which direction? They had struck some pretty solid rock, and water, which kept them bailing. They'd used the old-fashioned blasting powder and a time fuse. They made a sausage or cartridge out of blasting powder and the skin of a strong calico or canvas. The mouth sewn and bound to the end of the fuse, they dipped the cartridge in melted tallow. To make it watertight. To get the drill hole as dry as possible, drop the cartridge in with some dry dust, and wad off and ran with stiff clay and broken brick. Then they'd light the fuse, get out of the hole and wait. The result was usually a ugly pothole in the bottom of the shaft and half a barrow load of broken rock. There were plenty of fish in the creek, freshwater bream, cod, catfish, and tailors. The party were fond of fish, and Andy and Dave of fishing. Andy would fish for 3 hours at a stretch if encouraged by a nibble or a bite. Now and then, say once every 20 minutes. The butcher was always willing to give meat in exchange for the fish when they caught more than they could eat. But now it was winter, and these fish just wouldn't bite. However, the creek was low, and just a chain of muddy waterholes from the hole with a few bucketfuls in it to the sizable pool with an average dip of 5 to 7 feet. And they could get fish by bailing out the smaller holes or muddying out the water in the larger ones till the fish rose to the surface. There was catfish with spikes growing out of the back of its head. If you got pricked, you'd know it, as Dave said. And he took off his boots, tucked up his trousers, and went into a hole one day to stir up the mud with his feet. Oh, and he knew it. Dave scooped one out with his head and got pricked. Oh, he knew it too. His arm swelled, the pain throbbed up to his shoulder and kept down to his stomach too. He said it was like a toothache he had once, and kept him awake for 2 whole nights. Only a toothache pain had a bird edge, Dave said. Dave had an idea. Why not blow up the fish in the big waterhole with a cartridge? He said. I'll try it. He thought about the thing out, and Andy Page worked it out. Andy usually put Dave's theories into practice if they were practicable, or bore the blame for the failure and the chaffing of his mates if they weren't. He made a cartridge about 3 times the size of the ones they used in the rock. Jim Bentley thought it was big enough to blow out the bottom of the Body River. The inner skin was of stout calico, and Andy stuck the end of the 6-foot piece of fuse down into the powder and bound the mouth of the bag firmly to it with whipcord. The idea was to sink the cartridge in the water with the open end of the fuse attached to a float on the surface, ready for lighting. And Andy dipped the cartridge in melted beeswax to make it watertight. We'll have to leave it some time before we light it, Dave said. Give the fish some time to get over their scare once we put it in, and come nosing around again. So we'll want it well watertight. Round the cartridge, Andy, at Dave's suggestion, bound a strip of sail canvas they used for making water bags to increase the force of the explosion, and around that he plastered layers of stiff brown paper. On the plan of sorts of fireworks we call gun crackers. He let the paper dry in the sun, and he sewed the 2 coverings of 2 thickness of canvas over it, and bound the thing from end to end with stout fishing line. Dave's schemes were elaborate, and he often worked his inventions out to nothing. The cartridge was rigid, solid now, a formidable bomb. But Andy and Dave wanted to be sure. Andy sewed another layer of canvas, dipped the cartridge in melted tallow, twisted a length of fencing wire around it afterthought, and dipped it in tallow again, and stood it carefully against the tent peg, where he'd know he'd find it, and wound the flues loosely around it. Then he went to the campfire to try some potatoes that were boiling in their jackets and a billy, to see about frying some chops for dinner, and Dave and Jim were at work in the claim that morning. They had a big black young retriever dog, of rather an overgrown pup, a big foolish four-bruted mate, who was always slobbering around them, lashing their legs with a heavy tail that swung around like a rock whip. Most of his head was usually a red, idiotic, slobbering grin of appreciation at his own silliness. He seemed to take life, the world, and his two-legged mates, and his own instincts as a huge joke. He'd retrieve anything. He carted back most of the camp rubbish that Andy threw away. They had a cat that died in the hot weather, and Andy threw it a good distance away in the scrub, and early one morning, the dog found the cat, after it had been dead for a week or so, and carried it back to camp, laid it just inside the tent flaps, where it could best make its presence known when the mates should rise and begin to sniff suspiciously in the sickly, smothering atmosphere of the summer sunrise. He used to take their hands in his mouth, and try and swim out with them, scratch their naked bodies with his paws. He loved them for his They loved him for his good-heartedness and his foolishness. But when they wished to enjoy a swim, they had to tie him up in camp. You know, I have a dog that my aunt... no, actually, my cousin, who used to live with my aunt, of course. But my cousin owned a dog like that. They all called him Buff, because he was a big black... oh, I can't remember what breed he was, but he was massive. And he was big, and he was a black dog, and he was just as much of an idiot. Slobbering around. He would also do that thing if you swam anywhere near him. He'd try and rescue you. He'd bite you and try and bring you back to shore. Did exactly the same as this little thing did. Ah, good old Buff. Silly, silly dog. I had to take care of him for quite some time. A 6-month period I took care of him once. He was a frustrating dog to take care of, but you couldn't hate him for too long. He was just a... where were we? He watched Andy, the dog, by the way, with great interest all morning, making the cartridge, and hindered him considerably, trying to help. But about noon he went off to claim to see how Dave and Jim were getting on, and to come home to dinner with them. Andy saw him coming, and put a pan full of mutton chops on the fire. Andy was cooked today, and Dave and Jim stood with their backs to the fire, as bushmen do in all weathers, waiting till dinner should be ready. The retriever went nosing around, waiting till after something he seemed to have missed. Andy's brain still worked on the cartridge. His eye was caught by the glare of an empty kerosene tin lying in the bushes. It struck him that it wouldn't be a bad idea to sink the cartridge packed with clay, sand or stones in a tin to increase the force of the explosion. It may have been all out from a scientific point of view, but the notion looked all right to him. Jim Bentley, by the way, wasn't interested in their damned silliness. And Andy noticed an empty treacle tin, the sort with a little tin neck or spout soldered onto this that would make a best kind of cartridge case. You would only have to pour the powder, stick the fuse through the neck, and cork and seal with beeswax. He was turning to suggest this to Dave, when Dave glanced over his shoulder to see how the chops were doing, and bolted. He explained afterwards that he thought he'd heard the pan spluttering extra, and looked to see if the chops were burning. Jim Bentley looked behind him and bolted after Dave. Andy stood stock still, staring after them. "Run, Andy, run!" they shouted back at him. "Run! Look behind you, you fool!" Andy turned and looked, and there, close behind him, was the retriever, with the cartridge in his mouth, wedged into his broadest and silliest grin. And that wasn't all. The dog had come round the fire to Andy, and the loose end of the fuse had trailed and waggled over the burning sticks, into the blaze. And Andrew had slit and nicked the firing end of the fuse well. And now it was hissing and spitting properly, as it should. Andy's legs started with a jolt, His legs started before his brain did. He made after Dave and Jim, and the dog followed Andy. Dave and Jim were good runners, Jim the best. For a short distance, Andy was slow and heavy, but he had the strength and wind that he could last. The dog capered around him, delighted as a dog could be to find his mates, as he thought, on a frolic. Allah! Dave and Jim kept shouting back, "Don't follow us! Don't follow us, you coloured fool!" And Andy kept on, no matter how they dodged. They could never explain, any more than the dog, why they followed each other. But so they ran. Dave kept keeping in Jim's tracks, in all its turnings, and Andy after Dave, and the dog circling round Andy, the live fuse swishing in all directions, hissing, spluttering, and stinking. Jim yelled to Dave not to follow him, Dave shouting to Andy to go in another direction, to spread out, and Andy roaring at the dog to go home. And then Andy's brain began to work. He simulated the crisis. Stimulated by the crisis, he tried to get a running kick at the dog. The dog dodged, snatched up the sticks and stones, threw at him, and the dog ran on. The retriever saw that he'd made a mistake about Andy, and left him and bounded after Dave. Dave, who had the presence of mind to think the fuse time wasn't up yet, made a dive and grabbed the dog, caught him by the tail. And as he swung round, snatched the cartridge out of the dog's mouth and flung it as far as he could. The dog immediately bounded after and retrieved it. Dave roared and cursed at the dog, who, seeing that Dave was offended, left him and went after Jim, who was well ahead. Jim swung into a sapling and went up like a native bear. It was a young sapling. Jim couldn't freely get up more than if it was a kitten. At the foot of the sapling, capered and leaped and joyously whooped round under Jim, the big pup reckoned that this was part of the lark. He was all right. Now it was Jim who was out for a spree. The fuse sounded as if it was going a mile a minute. Jim climbed higher, and the sapling bent and cracked. Jim fell on his feet and ran. The dog swooped on the cartridge and followed. It all took but a very few months. Jim ran into a digger's hole, about 10 feet deep, and dropped down it. Over the edge, landing on the soft mud. And it was safe. The dog grinned sardonically down on him, over the edge, for a moment, as if he thought it would be good luck to drop down the cartridge on Jim. "Go away, Tommy," Jim said feebly. "Go away." The dog bounded off after Dave. He was the only one in sight now. Andy had dropped behind a log where he lay flat on his face, having suddenly remembered a picture of the Russo-Turkish War, with the circle of Turks lying on their flat of their faces, as if they were ashamed, round a newly arrived shell. There was a small hotel, or shanty, on the creek, on the main road, not far from the claim. Dave was desperate, and time flew much faster in this simulated imagination than it did in reality, so he made for the shanty. There were several casual bushmen on the veranda and the bar. So Dave rushed to the bar and on the door behind him. "My dog!" Where's this one actually? He's like, "My dog!" he cast in reply to an astonished stare of the publican. "The blanky retriever, he's got a live cartridge in his mouth." The retriever, finding the front door shut against him, had bounded round by the back way, and now stood, smiling in the doorway to the passage. The cartridge, still in his mouth, the fuse, still spluttering. They burst out of the bar. Tommy bounded after the first one, then another. For being a young dog, he tried to make friends with everyone. The bushmen ran around corners. Some shut themselves in the stable, where there were new weatherboard and corrugated iron kitchen and wash house on piles of the backyard, with some women washing clothes inside. Dave and the publican bundled in there, shut the door, and the publican cursing Dave and calling him a crimson fool, in hurried tones, wanting to know what the hell he came here for. The retriever went under the kitchen, amongst the piles, but luckily for those inside, there was a vicious yellow mongrel, a cattle dog scolting, and a nursing his nastiness under there. A sneaking, fighting, thieving canine whose neighbours had tried for years to shoot or poison it. Tommy saw his danger he'd experienced from this dog, and started out across the yard, still sticking to the cartridge. Halfway across the yard, the yellow dog caught him, nipped him. Tommy dropped the cartridge and gave one terrified yell and took into the bush. Oh! The yellow dog followed into a fence and then ran back to see what he had dropped. Oh my god, it's very itchy. Goodness. Nearly a dozen other dogs came round all the corners and under the buildings. Spidery, thievish, cold-blooded kangaroo dogs. Mongrel sheep and cattle dogs. Vicious black and yellow dogs. That slip after you in the dark, nip at your heels, and vanish without explaining. A yapping, yelping small fry. They kept a respectable distance around the nasty yellow dog, for it was dangerous to go near him. When he had thought he had found something which might be good for a dog or a cat, he sniffed at the cartridge twice, and was just taking a third cautious sniff, when bang! It was very good blasting powder, a new brand that Dave had recently got up from Sydney, and the cartridge had been excellently well made, and he was very patient and painstaking in all he did. Nearly as handy as the average sailor with needle, twine, canvas, and rope. The bushmen say that the kitchen jumped off its piles now and again. When the smoke and dust cleared away, the remains of the nasty yellow dog were against the paling fence of the yard, looking as if it had been kicked into a fire by a horse, and afterwards rolled into the dust under a barrow, and finally thrown against a fence from a distance. Several saddle horses, which had been hanging up by the veranda, were galloping wildly down the road in a cloud of dust. With broken bridle reins flying, and from a circle around the outskirts, from every point of the compass in the scrub, came yelping of dogs. 2 went home, to the place where they were born, 30 miles away, and reached it the same night, and stayed there. It was not till toward the evening that the rest came back to cautiously make inquiries. One was trying to walk on 2 legs. Most of them looked like more or less singed, and a little singed stubby-tailed dog, who'd been in the habit of hopping the back half of him along with 1 leg, had reason to be glad that he'd saved the other leg all those years, for he needed it now. There was one old one-eyed cattle dog that round the shanty for years afterwards, who couldn't stand the smell of gun being cleaned. It was who had taken an interest, only a second to that of the yellow dog in the cartridge. Bushman said it was amusing to slip up on his blind side and stick a dummy ramrod under his nose. He wouldn't wait to bring his solitary eye to bear. He'd take the bush to the bush and stay out all night. For half an hour or so after the explosion, several bushmen behind the stable would crouch, doubled up against the wall, or roll gently in the dust, trying to laugh without shrieking. There were 2 white women in hysterics at the house, and a half-caste rushing aimlessly around with a dipper of cold water. The publican was holding his wife tight and begging her between squats. "Hold up for my sake, Mary, or I'll land the life out of ye." Dave decided to apologize later on, when things had settled a little bit, and went back to camp. The dog had done it all. Tommy, the great, idiot mongrel retriever, came slobbering around Dave and lashing his legs with his tail, trotting on him after him, smiling his broadest, longest, and reddest smile of amiability, and apparently satisfied for one afternoon with the fun he'd had. And he chained the dog up securely, cooked some more chops, while Dave went to help Jim out of the hole. And this is why, for years afterwards, lanky, easy-going bushman, riding lazily past Dave Camp, would cry, in a lazy drawl and just a hint of the nasal twang, "Oh, Dave, eh? How's the fishing getting on, Dave?" The end. For those who like dogs, it probably doesn't sound as a funny story, but it's almost slapstick. I want a slapstick comedy recreation of this bloody thing. That's what I want. Probably exists, actually. I should check it out. I've only ever read the short story. Read it in high school originally. As you can tell, it's a very old story. But yes, that is the classic story of the loaded dog. It is quite the Strange little tale. Not one you'd hear these days, but I do wonder if that's ever happened. In actuality, it perhaps was based on a real story that Henry Lawson had heard, or a tall tale that Henry had come across in a pub at the time. It was... When was Henry Lawson writing? Back in the 19th century, right? I've forgotten. Have to look it up, I suppose. Henry Lawson. Yes, the 19th century, mid-19th century. 1867 was when he... Born, died in early 20th century. Wow, he lived quite a while. God, when he had died. I don't really keep track of those things. Not really as important when you're analysing his poetry, or in the case, The Drover's Wife, his more famous story. But yes, how'd you all enjoy that? I just realised I hadn't asked. Did you all find that amusing, if not a little strange? Yes. I don't know if we'll have much more to do. I was planning on ending at 12. So we can finish for something short, I suppose, but I don't think I have much more I can do. I've read it before, the last time you read it. Oh yes, I did read it before, I'd forgotten actually. Yeah, I did read it. It was part of the poetry one too there, wasn't it? So I decided I'd read it again, the more short story one. Technically, I did read 2 short stories. It was still good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope I did a good rendition. Just trying to see if I can all find anything good to read. While I'm still here. Oh, excuse me. Found a book and I could read Aesop's Fables. Some of Aesop's Fables give you some advice. I found the old book in the library. Didn't realise I still had it. Aesop's Fables. He was a very famous he wrote quite a few fables that give messages and meanings. He is the one, I believe, who is counted as having written The Tortoise and the Hare. But nobody knows that much about him, if I remember correctly. Let's see. Oh, interesting one. The oxen and the butchers. The oxen once upon a time decided to destroy the butchers who had killed them and sold their hides and meat. They assembled on a certain day to carry out their purpose, sharpened their horns for the contest. One of them said, who was very old, for many fields he had ploughed, said, "These butchers, it is true, slaughter us, but they also do so with skillful hands. And on no necessary pain. If we get rid of them, we shall fall in the hands of unskilled workers, and thus be double dead. For you shall be assured that through all the butchers should perish, men will always eat beef. So do not be in a hurry to exchange one evil for another." There you go. Look, the fox and the goat. A fox fell into a deep well and could find no means of escape. A goat, overcome by thirst, came to the same well. Seeing the fox, inquired if the water was good. The fox, concealing his misfortune under a cheerful smile, began to hold forth on the excellence of the water, saying that it was quite the most delicious water he had ever drunk, and that the goat must come down and taste it. The goat, mindful of his thirst, thoughtlessly jumped down. When he'd quenched his thirst, the fox told him that the difficulty they were both in, and suggested the scheme for their escape. "If," said he, "you place your 4 feet upon the wall and bend your head, I will run up your back and escape, and help you out afterwards." The goat thought this was a fine plan, and readily agreed. The fox leapt upon his back, and steadying himself with the goat's horns, reached the mouth of the well safely. He then immediately ran off as fast as he could. The goat cried out to him to stop, and fulfill his part of the bargain. But the fox turned around and replied, "You foolish fellow, if you had as many brains in your head as you have hairs in your beard, you would have never gone down before you had expected the way up, or exposed yourself to the dangers from which you have no means of escape. So look before you leap." The Philosopher and the Ants. A philosopher one day witnessed from the shore a shipwreck of a vessel and the drowning of her crew and passengers. He cried out against the wicked injustice of Providence, which would, perhaps, for the sake of one criminal sailing in this ship, so allow so many innocent lives to be lost. As he was engaged in these reflections, he found himself surrounded by a whole army of ants. One of them was crawling up his leg and stung him, and in his pain and anger he immediately trampled all of them to death. Mercury, the god, at once appeared before him, and striking the philosopher with his hand, said, "Who are you to make yourself a judge of the dealings of Providence, who have yourself in a similar manner treated those poor ants?" Now, finishing up soon, we could read a few more Aesop's fables, if you so wish. A dog used to run quietly to the heels of everyone he met to bite them. So his master at last hung his bell around his neck to warn people of the mischievous animal's presence. The dog grew proud of his bell. It used to go tinkling all over the marketplace, as though it was some sign of great distinction. One day an old hound said to him, "Why do you make such an exhibition of yourself? That bell you wear is not, believe me, any order of merit, but on the contrary a mark of disgrace. A public notice to all men to avoid you as an ill-mannered cur. Notoriety is often mistaken for fame." I just realized that a fair few internet creators, and even non-internet creators, journalists and the like, probably should learn that lesson. Sometimes it is not fame, it is notoriety, but unfortunately, they quite often act the same. So that is a good fable. I call that the terrible YouTuber's fable. Notoriety is often mistaken for fame, and unfortunately both of them still give you money. Yes. Other than that, one more of these. Let's see if I can find another good Aesop's fable. Ooh, here's a dramatic one. A fowler caught a partridge and was about to kill it when the bird implored him to save its life. "Master, let me live," it cried, "and I will entice 100 partridges to your nets in return for your mercy." The fowler replied, "I shall now most certainly take your life, for you are willing to save it at the cost of betraying your own kind." The Travellers and the Tree. Two travellers, worn out by the heat of the summer's sun, lay down at noon under the wide spreading branches of a pine tree. As they rested under its cool shade, "What a useless tree," one traveller said to the other. "What a useless tree this is! It bears no fruit, and it is not the slightest of use to man. You ungrateful fellow, while resting under my shade, you dare describe me as useless and unprofitable." Some do not recognize their best blessings, is the moral of that particular story. But yes. Ooh. Quite a few of these fables. I've forgotten how many of these and these phrases were associated with Aesop. Oh, this is a depressing one. The Lion, the Bear, and the Fox. A lion and a bear seized upon a kid at the same moment and fought fiercely for its possession. When they had cruelly clawed and bitten each other, they were faint after the long battle. They lay exhausted from their wounds. A fox, who had crept around them at a safe distance several times, saw them both stretched on the ground, and the kid, baby goat, by the way, lying untouched in the middle. Quickly he ran in between them, seizing the kid, and scampered off as fast as he could. The lion and the bear saw him, but not had the strength to give chase. "Woe betide us," said the lion, "that we should have fought and belaboured ourselves, only to serve in turn the fox. For it sometimes happens that one man has all the toil, and another all the profit." Ooh, very, very, very. Very interesting. But I think that's where she shall end for today. 2 hours in. Apologize. I think we shall end there. 2 hours exactly has just begun. So, how'd you all enjoy my reading? I know I didn't have as much interaction with you all, but that long joke was bloody long, I assure you. So, I hope you all enjoyed listening, and for those listening in posterity or those who just passed through, thank you for watching. And as always, those in the land of freedom and cattle, goodbye, sweet dreams, and do watch out that you don't do all the work only to give the profit to another man. Nighty night! Thank you for watching. Remember Aesop's fables. They do hold true to this day. Notoriety is not fame.